Heir to the Mafia. Francesca Barone had always known there were lines she could never cross. But when Lorenzo De Luca kissed her in the dark, when his hands gripped her like she belonged to him, she forgot every rule. Now, as their families prepared for war, she felt his breath against her ear. "You made a mistake, Dolcezza," he murmured. "Because now I don't plan on letting you go." Chapter 1. The Shadow of a Silent Vow. The funeral was a tapestry woven with grief and veiled threats. Francesca Barone stood beneath the oppressive weight of a gray Roman sky, the scent of lilies and damp earth clinging to the air. Her black dress, a somber echo of her late husband, Antonio, felt like a shroud, constricting her breath, mirroring the suffocating grip of her family's expectations. Antonio, a man 20 years her senior, had been a pillar of the Barone family, a respected capo, a man whose silence commanded more power than any shouted order. His death, a sudden heart attack, had ripped a hole not only in Francesca's carefully constructed life, but also in the fragile peace that held their world together. She watched as the pallbearers, men whose faces were etched with the harsh lines of their profession, carried Antonio's mahogany casket towards the family mausoleum. Each step was measured, deliberate, a silent testament to the gravity of the occasion. Around her, the whispers of the assembled mourners' family, associates, rivals cloaked in the guise of respect swirled like the gathering storm clouds. She could feel their eyes on her, assessing, calculating. A widow in the famiglia was a pawn, a bargaining chip, a potential liability. Francesca's fingers traced the intricate carvings of the antique silver locket she wore, a gift from Antonio on their wedding day. Inside, a miniature portrait of his stern face stared back at her. He had given it to her with a rare smile, his eyes softening for a fleeting moment. "To remind you," he had said, his voice a low rumble, "that you are always under my protection, Francesca. Always part of the Barone." But now, the protection was gone, and the weight of being part of the Barone pressed down on her with suffocating force. She had married Antonio out of duty, a strategic alliance arranged by her father, Don Alessandro Barone, when she was barely 20. Love had been a luxury they couldn't afford. Respect, loyalty, a quiet understanding, these were the cornerstones of their marriage. And Francesca had played her part impeccably, the elegant, composed wife, the gracious hostess, the silent observer. A hand, calloused yet gentle, touched her arm. She turned to see her brother, Marco, his face a mirror of her own grief, but hardened by years spent navigating the treacherous currents of their world. He was the heir apparent, the next on, and the burden of leadership already weighed heavily on his shoulders. "Francesca," he said, his voice low, barely audible above the murmurs of the crowd. "Father wants to see you after the burial. He has plans." The word plans hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Francesca knew what those plans likely entailed: another marriage, another alliance, another strategic move in the endless game of power. Her stomach churned with a familiar blend of dread and resignation. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She had spent her entire life adhering to the rules, fulfilling her obligations. But as she watched Antonio's casket disappear into the darkness of the mausoleum, a flicker of defiance, a spark of something she hadn't felt in years, ignited within her. The rain began to fall, a soft drizzle at first, then a steady downpour. The mourners dispersed, seeking shelter under umbrellas and the eaves of nearby buildings. Francesca remained standing by the open grave, the rain plastering her hair to her forehead, soaking through her dress. She felt strangely detached, as if she were watching the scene unfold from a distance. A figure emerged from the retreating crowd, tall and imposing, his face hidden beneath the shadow of a black umbrella. He approached her slowly, his footsteps silent on the wet grass. As he drew closer, she recognized him, Lorenzo De Luca. The De Lucas and the Baroness were ancient rivals, their feud stretching back generations, a tangled web of betrayals, bloodshed, and uneasy truces. Lorenzo was the son of Don Carlo De Luca, Antonio's contemporary and sworn enemy. His presence at the funeral was a calculated gesture, a display of both respect and veiled defiance. He stopped a few feet away, his dark eyes, intense and unreadable, fixed on her. The rain streamed down his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw, the slight curve of his lips. He was undeniably handsome, a dangerous beauty that sent a shiver down her spine. "Francesca," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the rain-soaked air. "My condolences." The words were formal, polite, but his gaze held something else, a flicker of something that made her breath catch in her throat. It was a look that acknowledged her not as a widow, not as a baronne, but as a woman. She met his gaze. Her own eyes narrowed. "Lorenzo, your presence here is unexpected." He inclined his head slightly, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "Respect for the dead, Francesca, and perhaps a curiosity to see how the Baronne widow fares in the storm." His words were a challenge, a subtle probe. He was testing her, gauging her strength, her vulnerability. Francesca straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin. She would not show him weakness. "The Baronne widow," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart, "fares as she always has, with strength and resilience." His smile widened, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "I wouldn't expect anything less." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, lingering on the locket she wore. "Antonio was a formidable man. He will be missed." The words, though seemingly sincere, carried a subtle undercurrent of something else, a hint of opportunity. Francesca felt a knot of unease tighten in her stomach. He took a step closer, the scent of his cologne, a blend of citrus and spice, mingling with the rain. "The world is changing, Francesca," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Old alliances are shifting. New ones are forming." She knew what he was implying. The death of Antonio had created a power vacuum, a shift in the delicate balance of their world. And Lorenzo De Luca, ever the opportunist, was circling, waiting to see where the pieces would fall. "And what part do you intend to play in this changing world, Lorenzo?" she asked, her voice laced with a hint of defiance. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. Then he reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her. "That, Francesca," he said, his voice a low, husky murmur, "remains to be seen." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain-soaked landscape, leaving Francesca standing alone, the weight of his words, the memory of his touch, lingering in the air like a silent promise or a threat. The spark of defiance within her grew stronger, fueled by a mixture of fear and a strange, unfamiliar excitement. She was no longer just the Baronne widow. She was a player in the game, whether she wanted to be or not. And she would have to navigate the treacherous waters ahead with a caution she hadn't needed before, because one wrong step, and she'd end up a prize, or another casualty, and something told her that Lorenzo De Luca had already chosen his approach. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Forgotten Garden. A week after the funeral, Francesca found herself drawn to the neglected rose garden behind the Baronne villa. It had been Antonio's sanctuary, a place where he cultivated rare varieties of roses, their thorny stems and delicate blooms a reflection of his own complex nature. Since his death, the garden had fallen into disarray, the flowers drooping, the pathways overgrown with weeds. It was a mirror of her own inner turmoil, a tangible representation of the life she had known crumbling around her. The air was thick with the scent of decaying petals and damp earth. The sun, a rare visitor in recent days, peeked through the clouds, casting long shadows across the overgrown paths. Francesca knelt beside a particularly neglected rose bush, its crimson blooms withered and brown. She reached out, her fingers gently tracing the delicate petals. "He loved these," a voice said from behind her. Francesca turned to see Marco standing at the edge of the garden, his hands clasped behind his back, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond mere grief. "The Rosso sang," he continued, his gaze fixed on the rose bush. "Blood red." He said it reminded him of the strength and fragility of life. Francesca nodded, unable to speak. The name, so fitting, so evocative of their world, hung in the air like a silent lament. Marco walked towards her, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path. He stopped beside her, his gaze sweeping over the neglected garden. He spent hours here, he said, his voice soft, almost nostalgic. Finding peace amidst the chaos. Francesca looked up at him, her eyes questioning. Did he ever talk about me? Marco hesitated, his gaze shifting away. He respected you, Francesca. He knew you were a valuable asset to the family. The words, though meant to be reassuring, felt like a cold slap. An asset. A valuable possession. Was that all she had ever been to Antonio? To her family? He also said, Marco continued, his voice softening, that you had a quiet strength. A resilience he admired. Francesca felt a flicker of warmth, a small ember of hope amidst the ashes of her grief. Perhaps there had been more to their relationship than she had realized. Perhaps, beneath the surface of duty and obligation, there had been a glimmer of something else. Father wants to see you tonight, Marco said, changing the subject abruptly. He has a proposal for you. The dread returned, a familiar weight settling in her stomach. She knew what was coming. Another marriage. Another alliance. Another sacrifice. I'm not sure I'm ready for another proposal, Marco, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Marco looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and frustration. Francesca, you know how things work. You are a baronne. Your duty is to the family. And what about my own desires, Marco? My own happiness? The words, spoken before she could stop them, hung in the air, heavy with unspoken rebellion. Marco's expression hardened. Happiness is a luxury we cannot afford, Francesca. Especially now. The DeLucas are making moves. They're testing our strength, probing for weaknesses. We need to show them we are united, unwavering. Francesca knew he was right. The fragile piece that held their world together was threatened, and her marriage was a crucial piece in the intricate game of power. But the thought of being bound to another man, another stranger, filled her with a sense of suffocating despair. There's someone else, Marco said, his voice hesitant, his gaze avoiding hers. Francesca's heart skipped a beat. Who? Marco hesitated, then took a deep breath. Don Carlo has proposed a union between you and Lorenzo. The words hit her like a physical blow. Lorenzo De Luca. Her husband's sworn enemy. The man who had looked at her with a mixture of challenge and desire in his eyes. The thought was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. He wants to marry me? She asked, her voice trembling. Marco Nari. It's a strategic move, Francesca. A way to unite the families, to end the feud, to secure peace. Peace. The words seemed almost laughable in the context of their lives. A peace bought with her freedom, her future. And what if I refuse? She asked, the words a whisper of defiance. Marco's expression darkened. You know you can't refuse, Francesca. It's not just about you. It's about the family. About our survival. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and despair. So I am to be a sacrifice, then? A pawn in your game? It's not a game, Francesca, Marco said, his voice sharp. It's our life. And you're a part of it. Whether you like it or not. He turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the neglected garden, the scent of roses and decay heavy in the air. The sun disappeared behind the clouds, casting the garden into shadow. Francesca closed her eyes, her mind reeling. Lorenzo De Luca. The thought was both terrifying and intriguing. He was a dangerous man, a man who lived by a different code, a man who could offer her either destruction or something else entirely. Something that whispered of freedom, of passion, of a life lived on her own terms. But at what cost? The question echoed in her mind, a haunting melody that played against the backdrop of her family's expectations and the looming threat of war. She opened her eyes, a new resolve hardening her gaze. She would meet with her father. She would hear the proposal, but she would not be a passive pawn. She would find a way to navigate this treacherous path, to protect herself, to perhaps even find her own way to bloom, even amidst the thorns. The seed of an idea, dangerous and exhilarating, began to take root in her heart. She would play the game, but she would play it on her own terms. Chapter 3. The Weight of Unspoken Promises. The dining room in the Barone villa was a testament to old-world grandeur. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a warm, golden glow over the long, mahogany table. Frescoes depicting scenes of Roman mythology adorned the walls, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the somber mood that hung in the air. Francesca sat at the table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Across from her sat her father, Don Alessandro Barone, his face a mask of stern authority. His silver hair, once thick and lustrous, was now thinning, but his eyes, dark and piercing, still held the same unwavering intensity that had always intimidated her. To his right sat Marco, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed on the intricate patterns of the tablecloth. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the clinking of silverware as the servants, their movements silent and efficient, served the elaborate meal. Francesca picked at her food, her appetite non-existent. The rich aromas of roasted lamb and rosemary-infused potatoes, usually a source of comfort, now churned her stomach. Finally, Don Alessandro cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the cavernous room. "Francesca," he said, his voice gravelly with age and authority, "we have much to discuss." She met his gaze, her own eyes steady despite the tremor in her heart. "I understand, father." He nodded, his lips forming a thin, tight line. "Marco has informed you of Don Carlo's proposal." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a reminder of her duty, her obligation. "Yes, father," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing, calculating. "It is a surprising offer," he said, his voice laced with a hint of skepticism. "The De Lucas have been our rivals for generations. This union would be unprecedented." Francesca remained silent, her gaze fixed on her father's face. She knew he was weighing the risks, the potential benefits, the possible consequences. But he continued, his eyes narrowing, "It could also be advantageous. A way to end the bloodshed, to secure peace, to strengthen our position." Peace. The word echoed in Francesca's mind, a hollow promise in a world built on violence and betrayal. "Don Carlo insists on a meeting," Don Alessandro said, his gaze sharpening. "He wants to discuss the terms with you personally." Francesca's heart skipped a beat. A meeting with Don Carlo De Luca, the man who had orchestrated countless acts of violence against her family, the father of the man who had looked at her with such intensity in his eyes. "When?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. "Tomorrow evening," Don Alessandro replied. "Here. In this very room." Francesca nodded, her mind racing. She would have to be careful, cautious. She would have to play the part of the dutiful daughter, the grieving widow, the potential bride. But beneath the surface, she would be searching for an advantage, a weakness, a way to navigate this treacherous path without losing herself completely. "Lorenzo will be with him," Marco added, his voice low, almost a warning. Francesca felt a shiver run down her spine. Lorenzo. The thought of facing him again, of seeing that look in his eyes, filled her with a mixture of dread and anticipation. Don Alessandro pushed his plate away, his gaze fixed on Francesca. "This is a delicate situation, Francesca," he said, his voice firm. "You must be discreet. You must be respectful. You must remember your duty to the family." "I understand, father," she repeated, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. He nodded, his expression softening slightly. "I know this is difficult, Francesca," he said, his voice almost gentle. "But you are strong. You are a Barone. You will do what is necessary." He rose from his chair, signaling the end of the meeting. Francesca and Marco stood as well, their movements mirroring his. "One more thing," Don Alessandro said, his gaze locking with Francesca's. "Don Carlo has requested that you wear the Rosso Sang rose in your hair." The request, so specific, so symbolic, sent a jolt of unease through Francesca. It was a test, a challenge, a way for Don Carlo to gauge her willingness, her compliance. "Of course, father," she replied, her voice betraying none of the turmoil she felt inside. As she left the dining room, the weight of her family's expectations, the looming threat of the DeLucas, the unspoken promises hanging in the air, pressed down on her with suffocating force. She walked toward her room, her steps slow and deliberate. As she passed a mirror, she caught a glimpse of her reflection. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed, but there was a new spark of determination in her gaze. She would wear the Rosso Sang rose. She would play the part, but she would not be a victim. She would find a way to survive, to protect herself, to perhaps even find a way to turn this dangerous alliance to her own advantage. The image of Lorenzo's face, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of challenge and desire, flashed through her mind. She clenched her fists, a surge of defiance coursing through her veins. She would face him, and she would not back down. The game had begun, and she was determined to play it to win. The whispers of the Forgotten Garden seemed to follow her, a promise and a threat intertwined. Chapter 4. A Dance Beneath a Treacherous Moon. The following evening, Francesca stood before her mirror, meticulously arranging the single, blood-red rose in her dark hair. The Rosso Sang, plucked from the heart of Antonio's neglected garden, felt heavy, a tangible symbol of the burden she carried. Its velvety petals, the color of dried blood, seemed to pulse with a life of their own, a silent reminder of the stakes involved. She wore a simple black dress, elegant and understated, its neckline subtly revealing the delicate curve of her collarbone. The fabric clung to her figure, hinting at the strength and resilience that lay beneath the surface of her composed demeanor. She had chosen no jewelry, save for the antique silver locket, which she wore hidden beneath the dress, a constant reminder of her past, a silent connection to the life she had known. Her reflection stared back at her, a stranger in familiar clothing. Her eyes, usually a soft hazel, were now dark and guarded, reflecting the turmoil within. Her lips, painted a delicate shade of rose, were set in a firm line, betraying none of the fear that churned in her stomach. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Marco entered, his expression somber, his usual confidence replaced with a hint of unease. "They're here," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Father is waiting." Francesca nodded, taking a deep breath to steady her nerves. "I'm ready." She followed Marco down the grand staircase, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the hushed silence of the villa. The air was thick with tension, a palpable sense of anticipation that made her skin prickle. As they approached the dining room, she could hear the murmur of voices, low and indistinct, a prelude to the storm that was about to break. Don Alessandro stood at the head of the table, his face a mask of stern authority. Beside him stood Don Carlo De Luca, a man whose presence radiated power and a subtle undercurrent of menace. He was older than Francesca had expected, his hair silvered, his face etched with the harsh lines of a life lived on the edge. But his eyes, dark and piercing, held the same unsettling intensity as his son's. And then there was Lorenzo. He stood slightly behind his father, his tall frame imposing, his presence dominating the room. He wore a dark suit that accentuated his broad shoulders and lean physique. His gaze met Francesca's, and a flicker of something amusement, challenge, perhaps even desire passed through his eyes. Francesca felt a jolt of electricity, a mixture of fear and a strange, unfamiliar excitement. She forced herself to remain composed, her expression betraying none of the turmoil she felt inside. Don Alessandro gestured towards the empty chair beside him. "Francesca," he said, his voice formal, "please join us." She walked towards the table, her movements graceful and deliberate, her gaze fixed on Don Carlo. She inclined her head slightly, a gesture of respect. "Don Carlo," she said, her voice steady, "it is an honor." He returned her nod, his lips curving into a thin smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The honor is mine, Francesca," he said, his voice a low rumble, "to finally meet the woman who has captured my son's attention." Francesca felt her cheeks flush, but she maintained her composure. She took her seat beside her father, her gaze shifting to Lorenzo. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, a silent challenge in his eyes. The meal was a tense affair, a carefully choreographed dance of words and gestures. Don Carlo dominated the conversation, his voice booming, his anecdotes filled with veiled threats and subtle boasts. He spoke of the need for unity, for strength, for a new era of peace between their families. But his words, though seemingly conciliatory, carried an undercurrent of something else, a hint of domination. Francesca listened, her senses on high alert, searching for any sign of weakness, any clue to his true intentions. She spoke sparingly, her words carefully chosen, her demeanor respectful, but not submissive. She was playing the part of the dutiful daughter, the potential bride, but beneath the surface, she was observing, analyzing, calculating. Lorenzo remained largely silent, his gaze fixed on Francesca. He watched her every move, every gesture, every flicker of emotion that crossed her face. His presence was a constant pressure, a silent reminder of the stakes involved. As the meal drew to a close, Don Carlo leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping over Francesca. "Lorenzo tells me you have a fondness for roses," he said, his voice a low purr. Francesca met his gaze, her own eyes steady. "I appreciate their beauty," she replied, her voice neutral. "And their resilience." A flicker of amusement crossed Don Carlo's face. "Indeed," he said, "resilience is a valuable trait, especially in our world." He paused, his gaze shifting to the Rosso Sang rose in her hair. "A fitting choice, Francesca. A symbol of strength and passion." The words, though seemingly complimentary, carried a subtle challenge, a test of her willingness to embrace the implications of their proposed alliance. "It was my late husband's favorite," she replied, her voice betraying none of the emotion she felt inside. Don Carlo nodded, his lips curving into a knowing smile. "A man of discerning taste," he said. He turned to Lorenzo. "Perhaps you would like to show Francesca the gardens," he suggested, his voice laced with a subtle suggestion. "It is a beautiful night." Lorenzo rose from his chair, his gaze locking with Francesca's. "It would be my pleasure," he said, his voice a low murmur. Francesca felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach, but she forced herself to rise as well. She knew this was a test, a chance for Lorenzo to assess her, to probe for weaknesses. As they walked out of the dining room, leaving the two Dons to their private discussions, Lorenzo fell into step beside Francesca. They moved in silence through the dimly lit hallways and out onto the terrace. The air outside was cool and crisp, a welcome change from the stifling atmosphere of the dining room. A full moon hung high in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the gardens, bathing the scene in an ethereal light. The scent of jasmine and night-blooming cereus filled the air, a heady fragrance that was both intoxicating and unsettling. They walked together, a dance beneath the moon that echoed with unspoken dangers. Lorenzo stopped at the edge of the neglected rose garden, his gaze sweeping over the overgrown paths and drooping flowers. He loved this place, he said, his voice soft, almost nostalgic. Francesca nodded, her gaze following his. It was his sanctuary. Lorenzo turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "And what is your sanctuary, Francesca?" he asked, his voice a low whisper. The question, so unexpected, so intimate, caught her off guard. She hesitated, unsure how to answer. He took a step closer, his presence filling her senses. "What do you desire, Francesca?" he asked, his voice a husky murmur. "What do you dream of?" The questions hung in the air, heavy with unspoken possibilities. The treacherous moon seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her answer. She looked into his eyes, and she felt a pull, a dangerous, magnetic that she would spend many nights struggling to understand. Chapter 5. Echoes of a Forbidden Touch. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken desires and hidden fears. The moonlight illuminated Lorenzo's face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw, the intensity of his gaze. He was close, too close, his presence overwhelming her senses. The scent of his cologne, that familiar blend of citrus and spice, mingled with the fragrance of the night-blooming flowers, creating a heady, intoxicating mix. Francesca struggled to find her voice, her mind reeling from the sudden shift in his demeanor. He had gone from the detached observer, the son of her family's enemy, to a man who was asking her about her dreams, her desires. It was a dangerous game he was playing, a subtle seduction that both terrified and intrigued her. "I don't know," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. She looked away, unable to hold his gaze, feeling exposed, vulnerable. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing against her cheek, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her. It was the same touch she had felt at the funeral, the one that had haunted her dreams, the one that had ignited a spark of something she hadn't felt in years. "Don't lie to me, Francesca," he said, his voice a low, husky murmur. "Not to yourself. Not to me." His words were a challenge, an invitation, a subtle demand that she acknowledge the connection between them, the forbidden attraction that simmered beneath the surface of their carefully constructed facades. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. She saw a flicker of something in his gaze, a vulnerability that mirrored her own, a hint of longing that belied the harsh realities of their world. "I want to be free," she whispered, the words a confession, a plea. "To make my own choices. To live my own life." The words, spoken aloud for the first time, felt both liberating and terrifying. She had dared to voice her deepest desire, to reveal her vulnerability to a man who could use it against her. He nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "Freedom is a rare commodity in our world, Francesca," he said, his voice soft. "But perhaps not an impossible one." He took another step closer, closing the distance between them. She could feel the warmth of his body, the subtle rise and fall of his chest. His eyes were dark, intense, filled with a mixture of desire and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. "What are you offering me, Lorenzo?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly.
En alliance?
"A marriage? Or something else?" He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Perhaps all three," he said, his voice a low purr. "And perhaps something more." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her face. His thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone, the soft skin beneath her eye. His touch was gentle, reverent, a stark contrast to the harshness of his world, the violence that lurked beneath the surface of his charming demeanor. Francesca felt her breath catch in her throat. She was drawn to him, pulled by an invisible force that defied logic, that ignored the boundaries of their family's feud, the dangers that surrounded them. She knew she should resist, should push him away, should maintain the distance between them. But she couldn't. "This is dangerous, Lorenzo," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against her ear. "Danger is our birthright, Francesca," he murmured. "It's in our blood. It's what makes us alive." His words sent a thrill of both fear and excitement through her.
He was right.
Danger was a constant companion in their lives, a shadow that followed them wherever they went. But there was something intoxicating about it, something that made her heart beat faster, that made her feel alive. He lowered his head, his lips hovering over hers. She could feel his breath on her skin, warm and inviting. She knew she should stop him, should turn away, should protect herself from the inevitable consequences of their actions. But she didn't. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the moment, to the forbidden desire that had been simmering between them since that first encounter at the funeral. His lips touched hers, softly at first, a tentative exploration, a silent question. Then, the kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more demanding. He tasted of darkness and desire, of secrets and forbidden pleasures. Francesca responded, her own lips parting beneath his, her body melting against his. She wrapped her arms around his neck, her fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. She had never felt anything like this before, this overwhelming surge of passion, this desperate need to lose herself in another person. The kiss lasted for an eternity, a moment outside of time, a stolen pleasure in a world of duty and obligation. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their hearts pounding, their bodies trembling. Lorenzo looked at her, his eyes dark with desire, his expression a mixture of triumph and tenderness. "You made a mistake, Dulcezza," he murmured, his voice husky. "Because now I don't plan on letting you go." The echoes of his touch lingered, a promise of more, a threat of forever. The forbidden seed had sprouted, and now the roots were too deep to deny, no matter the danger. The words were a claim, a declaration of possession. They were also exactly what the hidden part of her craved. Chapter 6. The Scent of Betrayal and Roses. The days following that stolen kiss in the moonlit garden were a blur of conflicting emotions for Francesca. She found herself caught between the expectations of her family, the looming threat of the alliance with the De Lucas, and the undeniable pull she felt towards Lorenzo. His words, "I don't plan on letting you go," echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the dangerous game they were playing. She tried to maintain a facade of composure, of dutiful obedience to her father's wishes. She attended meetings with Marco and Don Alessandro, listening to their discussions of strategy, of consolidating power, of securing the future of the Barone family. But her mind was elsewhere, lost in the memory of Lorenzo's kiss, the feel of his arms around her, the intensity of his gaze. She avoided the rose garden, unable to face the place where their forbidden connection had blossomed. The scent of roses, once a source of comfort, now triggered a mixture of longing and apprehension. She knew that every encounter with Lorenzo was a risk, a step closer to the edge of a precipice. One afternoon, she received a message, a small, unmarked envelope delivered by one of the household servants. Inside, a single, dried Rosso sang rose lay nestled on a bed of white velvet. There was no note, no signature, but she knew instantly who it was from. She held the rose in her hand, its brittle petals crumbling slightly at her touch. The scent, faint but unmistakable, transported her back to the garden, to the moment of their kiss. She closed her eyes, her heart aching with a mixture of desire and dread. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Marco entered, his expression troubled. "Father wants to see you," he said, his voice strained. "There's been a development." Francesca's stomach clenched with apprehension. She knew that development, in their world, usually meant trouble. She followed Marco to her father's study, a room filled with dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, and the lingering scent of cigar smoke. Don Alessandro sat behind his massive desk, his face grim, his eyes narrowed. "Sit down, Francesca," he said, his voice curt. She obeyed, her heart pounding against her ribs. "We have received information," Don Alessandro said, his gaze fixed on her, "that suggests the De Lucas are not entirely trustworthy." Francesca's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected as much, but to hear it confirmed, to know that her father was aware of the potential danger, filled her with a sense of dread. "What kind of information?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Don Alessandro hesitated, his gaze shifting to Marco. Marco stepped forward, his expression grim. "We have intercepted communications," he said, "between Don Carlo and other families. Families who are not friendly to the Baroness." Francesca's mind raced. She knew that the underworld was a complex web of alliances and rivalries, a constant shifting of power. If the De Lucas were secretly plotting with their enemies, it seems, Don Alessandro continued, his voice laced with anger, that Don Carlo's proposal of marriage may be a ruse. A way to infiltrate our family, to weaken us from within. Francesca felt a chill run down her spine. She had considered the possibility, but to hear it confirmed, to know that Lorenzo might be part of a plot to destroy her family, what are we going to do? She asked, her voice trembling. Don Alessandro leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on her. "We are going to proceed with caution," he said, his voice firm. "We will continue with the preparations for the alliance. But we will be vigilant. We will be watching their every move." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "And you, Francesca," he said, his voice hardening, "will be our eyes and ears. You will be closest to Lorenzo. You will gather information. You will uncover their true intentions. Francesca felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. She was being asked to spy on the man she desired, the man who had kissed her with such passion, the man who might be plotting her family's downfall. I don't know if I can do that, father, she said, her voice shaking. Don Alessandro's expression darkened. You will do what is necessary, Francesca, he said, his voice sharp. You are a Barone. Your loyalty is to the family. You will not betray us. The words were a command, a threat, a reminder of her duty, her obligation. She had no choice. I understand, father, she said, her voice barely a whisper. She rose from her chair, her legs trembling beneath her. As she left the study, she felt a sense of despair wash over her. She was trapped, caught between her family's expectations and her own conflicting desires. She was being asked to betray the man who had awakened something within her, the man who had made her feel alive. As she walked back to her room, she passed the entrance to the rose garden. She hesitated, her gaze drawn to the overgrown paths, the neglected flowers. The scent of roses, now mingled with the faint scent of betrayal, filled the air. She closed her eyes, her heart aching with a mixture of longing and despair. She knew that she had a difficult choice to make, a choice that could determine not only her own fate, but the fate of her family. The echoes of the forbidden touch were now tainted, the scent of roses a reminder of the dangerous game she was forced to play. And somewhere, she knew Lorenzo was watching, waiting. Chapter 7. Masks and Midnight Confessions. The following weeks were a carefully orchestrated performance. Francesca played the part of the eager bride-to-be, attending dinners, meetings, and social events with Lorenzo and his family. She smiled, she laughed, she charmed, all the while observing, analyzing, searching for any clue to their true intentions. Lorenzo was attentive, almost possessive, his eyes constantly on her, his touch lingering a little too long, his words laced with a subtle double meaning. He seemed to anticipate her every need, showering her with gifts, a delicate diamond bracelet, a rare first edition of Dante's Inferno, a silk scarf the color of her eyes. Each gift was a subtle reminder of his power, his wealth, his claim on her. Francesca accepted the gifts with a gracious smile, her heart heavy with a mixture of guilt and apprehension. She knew that she was deceiving him, playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse. But she also couldn't deny the thrill of their encounters, the spark of attraction that still flickered between them, the undeniable pull that drew her to him despite the risks. She found herself increasingly drawn to Lorenzo's complexity. He was a man of contradictions, a man who could be both charming and ruthless, tender and dangerous. He spoke of his love for art, for literature, for the beauty of Italy, but she knew that beneath the surface lay a darkness, a ruthlessness born from a life lived in the shadows. One evening, after a particularly lavish dinner at the De Luca villa, Lorenzo led Francesca to a secluded balcony overlooking the city. The lights of Rome twinkled below, a breathtaking panorama that seemed to stretch on forever. The air was cool and crisp, the scent of jasmine and night-blooming cereus filling the air. Lorenzo stood close behind her, his hands resting lightly on her waist. She could feel his breath on her neck, the warmth of his body against hers. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice a low murmur.
Rome.
"Our city." Francesca nodded, her gaze fixed on the twinkling lights. "It is," she replied, her voice soft. He turned her around to face him, his eyes searching hers. "And what about us, Francesca?" he asked, his voice a husky whisper. "Is this beautiful too?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. He was asking her about their connection, their forbidden attraction, the dangerous game they were playing. She hesitated, unsure how to answer. She couldn't deny the pull she felt towards him, the desire that still burned within her. But she also couldn't ignore the suspicions, the doubts, the knowledge that he might be using her. I don't know, Lorenzo," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "This is complicated." He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Life is complicated, Francesca," he said. "Especially our lives." He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the curve of her cheek. But sometimes, he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, sometimes the complications are worth it. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against hers. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the moment, to the forbidden pleasure of his touch. The kiss was soft, tentative at first, then deeper, more urgent. She responded, her own lips parting beneath his, her arms wrapping around his neck. She lost herself in the kiss, in the feel of his body against hers, in the desperate need to forget, to escape, to find a moment of solace in the midst of the chaos. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their hearts pounding. Lorenzo looked at her, his eyes dark with desire, his expression a mixture of triumph and vulnerability. "Tell me, Francesca," he said, his voice husky, "what are you so afraid of?" The question, so direct, so unexpected, caught her off guard. She looked away, unable to hold his gaze, feeling exposed, vulnerable. "I'm afraid of losing myself," she whispered, the words a confession, a plea. "Of becoming a pawn in your game." He was silent for a moment, his gaze searching hers. Then he reached out, his hand gently cupping her face. "I would never let that happen, Francesca," he said, his voice soft, almost a promise. "I would protect you. Always." The words, though seemingly sincere, sent a shiver of doubt through her. Could she trust him? Could she believe his promises? I want to believe you, Lorenzo," she said, her voice trembling. "But how can I?" He leaned closer, his lips brushing against her ear. "Trust is earned, Francesca," he murmured, "and I intend to earn yours." He kissed her again, a long, slow kiss that left her breathless and wanting more. As they stood there, embraced in the moonlight, Francesca felt a shift within her. She was still afraid, still uncertain, but she was also intrigued. She wanted to believe him, to trust him, to surrender to the forbidden desire that burned within her. The masks they both wore began to slip, just a fraction, and for the first time, she wondered if a midnight confession could ever truly lead to trust, or if it was just another layer of their elaborate dance. The city lights twinkled, oblivious to the dangerous game being played above them. Chapter 8. Scars beneath the surface. The charade continued, but cracks were beginning to appear in the carefully constructed facades. Francesca found herself increasingly torn between her duty to her family and the growing connection she felt with Lorenzo. She observed him closely, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of the betrayal her father suspected. But the more time she spent with him, the more conflicted she became. Lorenzo, for his part, seemed to be making a genuine effort to earn her trust. He opened up to her, sharing stories from his childhood, his dreams, his fears. He spoke of his desire to break free from the cycle of violence that had plagued his family for generations, his yearning for a different kind of life. One rainy afternoon, they found themselves alone in the DeLuca library, a vast room filled with ancient books, antique furniture, and the scent of old paper and leather. Lorenzo was showing her a collection of rare maps, his fingers tracing the faded lines of ancient trade routes. "My grandfather collected these," he said, his voice soft, almost nostalgic. "He always dreamed of traveling the world, of escaping the confines of our life." Francesca looked at him, her eyes searching his. "And do you share that dream, Lorenzo?" she asked. He met her gaze, his expression serious. "I do," he replied. "But it's not so easy to escape our past, Francesca. It's in our blood." He closed the map, his gaze shifting to the rain-streaked window. "Sometimes," he continued, his voice low, "I feel like I'm trapped, like I'm destined to repeat the mistakes of my father, my grandfather." Francesca saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, a hint of the pain that he usually kept hidden. She felt a surge of empathy for him, a desire to reach out and comfort him. "But you're not your father, Lorenzo," she said, her voice gentle. "You can choose a different path." He turned to her, a faint smile playing on his lips. "And what path would you choose for me, Francesca?" he asked, his voice a husky whisper. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken possibilities. She knew that he was asking her more than just about his future. He was asking her about their future. I would choose a path of peace, she said, her voice trembling slightly. A path of happiness. He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. And could you find happiness with me, Francesca? He asked, his voice a low murmur. Even knowing who I am? What I am? The question, so direct, so intimate, caught her off guard. She looked into his eyes, and she saw a longing, a vulnerability that mirrored her own. I don't know, Lorenzo, she whispered. I'm afraid. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against her ear. Don't be afraid, Dolcezza, he murmured. I would never hurt you. He kissed her, softly at first, then with increasing passion. She responded, her own lips parting beneath his, her arms wrapping around his neck. She lost herself in the kiss, in the feel of his body against hers, in the desperate need to believe his words, to trust in the connection between them. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their hearts pounding. Lorenzo looked at her, his eyes dark with desire, his expression a mixture of tenderness and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. He reached out, his hand gently pushing aside a strand of hair that had fallen across her face. His fingers lingered on her skin, tracing the delicate curve of her ear. There's something I want to show you, he said, his voice low. He led her to a hidden alcove behind one of the bookshelves. He pressed a hidden button, and a section of the wall slid open, revealing a small, secret room. Inside, the room was dimly lit, illuminated by a single oil lamp. The walls were lined with paintings, portraits of men and women in elaborate clothing, their faces stern, their eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sadness. These are my ancestors, Lorenzo said, his voice quiet. The De Lucas. Going back generations. Francesca looked at the portraits, her eyes scanning the faces, searching for a resemblance to Lorenzo. She saw the same sharp features, the same intense gaze, the same hint of darkness that lurked beneath the surface. Lorenzo pointed to a portrait of a man with a cruel smile and cold, calculating eyes. That's my grandfather, he said, his voice laced with a mixture of bitterness and regret. The man who started the feud with your family. He paused, his gaze shifting to another portrait, this one of a young woman with a sad, wistful expression. And that's my mother, he said, his voice softening. She died when I was young. She hated this life. She wanted something more. He turned to Francesca, his eyes searching hers. I see her in you, Francesca, he said, his voice a low murmur. That same longing for something more. That same strength. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. I don't want to be like them, he said, his voice filled with a raw honesty that she had never heard before. I don't want to live a life of violence, of betrayal. I want something different. With you. He took a deep breath, his gaze locking with hers. I know I have scars, Francesca, he continued, his voice raw. Scars that run deep. But I'm trying to heal. I'm trying to change. He gestured to a barely visible scar near his hairline. This. From a fight when I was younger. A reminder of who I used to be. The scars were not only physical, she realized, and seeing this hidden room, hearing his confession, made her question everything. Was this another layer of manipulation, or was he truly showing her his vulnerable side? The rain continued to fall outside, a melancholic soundtrack to their midnight revelations. Chapter 9. The Price of Loyalty and Longing. Lorenzo's confession in the hidden room had shaken Francesca to her core. She saw a vulnerability in him that she hadn't expected, a yearning for a different life that mirrored her own. But the doubts lingered, the suspicions planted by her father's warnings refusing to be silenced. Could she truly trust him? Or was this another layer of his carefully constructed facade, a masterful manipulation designed to win her over? She returned to the Barone villa with a heavy heart, her mind reeling from the conflicting emotions that churned within her. She found her father and Marco waiting for her in the study, their faces grim, their expressions expectant. Tell us everything, Don Alessandro said, his voice curt, his eyes narrowed. Francesca recounted her conversation with Lorenzo, his confession, his desire for a different life. She described the hidden room, the portraits of his ancestors, the vulnerability he had revealed. She omitted nothing, except for the intensity of their physical connection, the kisses that still burned on her lips. Don Alessandro listened intently, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the intricate patterns of the Persian rug beneath his feet. "It could be a trick," Marco said, his voice skeptical. "A way to gain your trust, to lower your guard." Francesca nodded, her own doubts echoing Marco's words. "I know," she said, her voice low, "but I also saw something else in him. A genuine desire for change." Don Alessandro looked up at her, his eyes searching hers. "And what do you believe, Francesca?" he asked, his voice soft, almost gentle. "Do you believe him?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Her answer could determine the fate of her family, the future of their alliance with the DeLucas, her own destiny. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly.
I'm torn.
Don Alessandro sighed, his expression softening. "This is a difficult situation, Francesca," he said. "And you are caught in the middle." He paused, his gaze shifting to Marco. "We need more information," he said. "We need to be certain." He turned back to Francesca, his eyes hardening. "You will continue to see Lorenzo," he said, his voice firm. "You will encourage his confidence. You will uncover the truth." Francesca felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She was being asked to continue the deception, to play the part of the willing bride, while secretly searching for evidence of his betrayal. It was a dangerous game, a tightrope walk between loyalty and longing, between duty and desire. "I understand, Father," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She left the study, her heart heavy with the weight of her responsibility. She knew that she was walking a dangerous path, that one wrong step could have devastating consequences. The following days were a blur of carefully orchestrated encounters with Lorenzo. She allowed him to court her, to shower her with attention, to believe that he was winning her over. But beneath the surface, she was constantly observing, analyzing, searching for any clue to his true intentions. She found herself increasingly drawn to him, despite her doubts, despite the warnings of her family. She saw the kindness in his eyes, the tenderness in his touch, the genuine desire for connection that seemed to flicker beneath the surface of his carefully constructed facade. One evening, Lorenzo took her to a small, intimate trattoria hidden away in a quiet corner of Trastevere. It was a place far removed from the opulent villas and lavish parties they usually frequented, a place where ordinary Romans gathered to share food, wine, and conversation. They sat at a small table tucked away in a corner, the candlelight flickering softly, casting shadows on the walls. The air was filled with the aroma of garlic, basil, and freshly baked bread. Lorenzo ordered for them in fluent Italian, his voice low and melodious. He chose simple, traditional dishes: cacio e pepe, saltimbocca, a bottle of local red wine. As they ate, they talked, not about the families, not about the alliance, but about their lives, their dreams, their fears. Lorenzo spoke of his love for music, his passion for art, his desire to travel the world. Francesca shared her own dreams, her longing for a life beyond the confines of her family's expectations, her desire to make a difference in the world. For a few precious hours, they were not a Barone and a DeLuca, not pawns in a dangerous game of power, but simply a man and a woman, sharing a meal, sharing their thoughts, sharing a connection that transcended the boundaries of their world. As they walked back to the villa, hand in hand, through the quiet, moonlit streets of Rome, Francesca felt a sense of peace, a fleeting moment of happiness that she hadn't experienced in years. But as they approached the villa, reality came crashing back. She saw the guards, the security cameras, the reminders of the dangerous world they inhabited. She knew that the peace was fragile, that the happiness was fleeting, that the price of their loyalty and their longing could be devastating. The trattoria felt like a distant dream, a bubble of normalcy in a world defined by shadows and secrets. As Lorenzo said goodnight, His kiss was tinged with a sadness that mirrored her own. Chapter 10. A storm brewing in paradise. The impending alliance between the Barone and De Luca families was the talk of Rome's underworld. Preparations for the wedding were underway, a lavish affair designed to showcase the newfound unity and strength of the two families. Francesca found herself swept up in a whirlwind of dress fittings, menu tastings, and endless meetings with wedding planners. It was a surreal experience, a performance she played with increasing unease. She continued to meet with Lorenzo, their encounters a mixture of genuine connection and carefully calculated deception. She searched for evidence of his betrayal, for any sign that he was playing her, using her for his own gain. But the more time she spent with him, the more conflicted she became. She saw the kindness in his eyes, the tenderness in his touch, the moments of vulnerability that he allowed her to glimpse. One afternoon, Lorenzo took her to a secluded villa on the outskirts of Rome, a place he called his sanctuary. It was a beautiful estate, surrounded by lush gardens, rolling hills, and a breathtaking view of the Mediterranean Sea. "This is where I come to escape," he said, his voice soft, as they walked through the gardens. "To find peace. To be myself." Francesca looked around, her eyes taking in the beauty of the surroundings. It was a world away from the dark, oppressive atmosphere of the Barone and De Luca villas, a place where she could almost forget the dangers that lurked beneath the surface of their lives. They spent the afternoon exploring the gardens, talking, laughing, sharing stories. Lorenzo showed her his favorite flowers, his hidden pathways, his secret corners. He seemed different here, more relaxed, more open, more vulnerable. As the sun began to set, they found themselves on a terrace overlooking the sea. The sky was ablaze with color, a breathtaking display of oranges, pinks, and purples. The air was warm and balmy, the scent of salt and sea air filling their lungs. Lorenzo stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. She leaned back against him, her body molding to his, feeling a sense of comfort, of belonging that she hadn't expected. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice a low murmur. "Paradise." Francesca nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It is," she replied, her voice soft. He turned her around to face him, his eyes searching hers. "Could you be happy here, Francesca?" he asked, his voice a husky whisper. "With me?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. He was asking her about their future, about the possibility of a life together, a life beyond the confines of their family's feud. She looked into his eyes, and she saw a longing, a hope that mirrored her own. But she also saw the shadows, the doubts, the uncertainties that still lingered. I don't know, Lorenzo," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I want to believe," but he reached out, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. "But you're still afraid," he said, his voice soft. "You still don't trust me." She nodded, unable to speak, tears welling up in her eyes. He pulled her closer, his embrace tightening. "I understand," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I know I have a lot to prove." He kissed her, softly at first, then with increasing passion. She responded, her own lips parting beneath his, her arms wrapping around his neck. She lost herself in the kiss, in the feel of his body against hers, in the desperate need to believe in the possibility of their happiness. But as they kissed, a storm began to brew, both literally and figuratively. The wind picked up, whipping through the gardens, the sky darkening with ominous clouds. The first drops of rain began to fall, splattering on the terrace, mirroring the turmoil within Francesca's heart. Lorenzo broke the kiss, his eyes searching hers. "We should go inside," he said, his voice strained. They hurried back to the villa, the storm raging around them. As they reached the shelter of the entrance, lightning flashed, illuminating the sky with a brilliant white light. Thunder rumbled, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Francesca felt a sense of unease, a premonition of danger. The storm seemed to reflect the turmoil within her, the conflicting emotions that threatened to tear her apart. As they stood there, watching the storm rage, Francesca knew that the peace they had found in this paradise was fragile, that the storm brewing within their families, within their own hearts, could destroy everything. The beautiful sunset was a distant memory, replaced by the raw power of nature, a reminder of the forces they could not control. And as another lightning bolt cracked across the sky, she saw a flicker of something in Lorenzo's eyes. Fear, perhaps? Or was it anticipation? The storm had arrived, and she knew, deep down, that their lives were about to change forever. Chapter 11. Shattered reflections of the past. The storm raged throughout the night, relentless assault of wind and rain that mirrored the turmoil within Francesca's heart. She lay in bed in the guest room of Lorenzo's villa, unable to sleep, her mind racing with conflicting emotions. She was drawn to Lorenzo, to the tenderness he showed her, to the possibility of a life beyond the confines of her family's expectations. But the doubts lingered, the suspicions planted by her father's warnings refusing to be silenced. As dawn approached, the storm finally subsided, leaving behind a trail of destruction. The gardens were battered, the trees uprooted, the flowers scattered like fallen confetti. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and broken branches. Francesca rose from bed, her body aching, her mind exhausted. She dressed quickly and went downstairs, finding Lorenzo already in the kitchen making coffee. He turned as she entered, his face etched with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft. "You look pale." Francesca nodded, forcing a smile. "I'm fine," she replied. "Just didn't sleep well." He poured her a cup of coffee, his hand brushing against hers as he handed it to her. The touch sent a shiver down her spine, a reminder of their connection, of the passion that still simmered between them. They drank their coffee in silence, the only sound the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirping of birds. The storm had passed, but the atmosphere in the room remained heavy with unspoken tension. "I need to go back to Rome," Francesca said, breaking the silence. "My father will be expecting me." Lorenzo nodded, his expression unreadable. "I understand," he said. "I'll drive you." The drive back to the city was quiet, their conversation strained. Francesca stared out the window, her mind lost in thought. She was replaying every conversation she had had with Lorenzo, searching for any clue, any slip-up, any indication of his true intentions. As they approached the Barone villa, Francesca felt a growing sense of unease. She had a premonition, a feeling that something was wrong. When they arrived, they found the villa in chaos. Guards were running around, their faces grim, their voices hushed. The front door was open, the entrance hall filled with shattered glass and overturned furniture. Francesca's heart pounded in her chest. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lorenzo gripped her arm, his expression hardening. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. "I'll go inside." He disappeared into the villa, leaving Francesca standing alone, her mind racing with fear. She waited, her heart pounding, her senses on high alert. After what seemed like an eternity, Lorenzo returned, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and grief. "It's your brother," he said, his voice strained.
Marco.
"He's been shot." Francesca felt the blood drain from her face.
What?
She gasped, her voice barely a whisper.
How? Who?
Lorenzo shook his head, his expression grim.
"I don't know," he said. "They're saying it was a rival family."
An ambush. Francesca felt a wave of nausea wash over her.
Marco.
Her brother. The heir to the Barone family.
Shot.
Possibly dead. She pushed past Lorenzo, running into the villa. She found her father in the study, his face ashen, his eyes filled with tears. He was surrounded by guards, their expressions grim. "Father!" Francesca cried, rushing to his side. "What happened? Is Marco?" Don Alessandro looked up at her, his gaze filled with a mixture of grief and accusation. "He's alive," he said, his voice hoarse.
"But barely."
"They took him to the private clinic." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "And they're saying," he continued, his voice hardening, "that it was the De Lucas." Francesca felt a chill run down her spine. The De Lucas. Lorenzo's family. Accused of attacking her brother. She looked at Lorenzo, who was standing in the doorway, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. "It wasn't us," he said, his voice firm. "I swear to you, Francesca. We had nothing to do with this." But Don Alessandro's gaze was fixed on Francesca, his eyes filled with suspicion. "You were with him," he said, his voice accusing. "You were with Lorenzo. All night." Francesca felt the weight of her father's words, the implication of her betrayal. She had been with Lorenzo, while her brother was being attacked. She had been sharing intimate moments with the man whose family was now accused of trying to kill her brother. "Father, she began, her voice trembling. But Don Alessandro cut her off. "Get out," he said, his voice cold, his eyes filled with a mixture of grief and hatred. "Get out of my sight." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her father, her family, turning against her, accusing her of complicity in her brother's attack. The shattered reflections of her past, of her family, of her loyalty, lay scattered around her, impossible to piece back together. The storm had broken, and she was adrift, alone, caught between two warring families, her heart torn in two. Lorenzo took a step towards her, but she backed away, unable to meet his eyes. The trust, so fragile, was shattered. Chapter 12. The Unraveling of Sacred Bonds. Francesca fled the Barone villa, her heart shattered, her mind reeling. She felt betrayed by her family, accused of complicity in an act she had no part in. She felt betrayed by Lorenzo, by the possibility that he had been lying to her, using her for his own gain. She felt betrayed by her own emotions, by the connection she had felt with him, the desire that had blinded her to the truth. She wandered the streets of Rome, aimlessly, lost in a sea of grief and confusion. The city, once a source of comfort, now felt alien, hostile. She saw the faces of strangers, their eyes indifferent, their lives untouched by the turmoil that raged within her. She found herself drawn to the Tiber River, its dark waters flowing silently beneath the ancient bridges. She stood on the Ponte Sant'Angelo, gazing down at the swirling currents, her mind filled with despair. She had lost everything: her family, her home, her future. She considered ending it all, of jumping into the river, of escaping the pain, the confusion, the betrayal. But something held her back, a flicker of defiance, a spark of resilience that refused to be extinguished. She was a Barone, even if her family had disowned her. She was strong, even if she felt broken. She would survive, even if she didn't know how. She walked away from the bridge, her steps slow but determined. She needed a place to stay, a place to think, a place to plan her next move. She had a small amount of money, some jewelry she had managed to grab before fleeing the villa. It wasn't much, but it was enough to survive for a while. She found a small, unassuming pensione in a quiet neighborhood, far from the opulent villas of her former life. She paid for a room, a simple, sparsely furnished space with a single bed, a small table, and a window overlooking a courtyard. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, a place to hide, a place to heal. She spent the next few days in her room, barely eating, barely sleeping, her mind consumed by grief and confusion. She replayed every conversation she had had with Lorenzo, searching for any clue, any sign of deception. She thought about her brother, Marco, lying injured in a private clinic, his life hanging in the balance. She thought about her father, his face filled with grief and accusation. She knew that she couldn't stay hidden forever. She needed to find out the truth, to clear her name, to understand what had happened to her brother. She needed to decide where her loyalty lay: with her family, who had betrayed her, or with Lorenzo, who might be her enemy. One evening, as she sat by the window, gazing out at the courtyard, she heard a knock on the door. Her heart pounded in her chest. Who could it be? The police? Her father's men? Lorenzo? She hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. She took a deep breath and opened the door. Standing in the hallway was Lorenzo. His face was pale, his eyes filled with concern. He looked as though he hadn't slept in days. "Francesca," he said, his voice hoarse. "I've been looking everywhere for you." She stared at him, her expression a mixture of anger, confusion, and relief. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice cold. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I had to see you," he said. "I had to explain." "Explain what?" she asked, her voice rising. "Explain how your family tried to kill my brother? Explain how you lied to me, used me?" He reached out to her, but she flinched away. "It wasn't us, Francesca," he said, his voice pleading. "I swear to you, we had nothing to do with it." "Then who did?" she demanded. "Who attacked Marco?" Lorenzo hesitated, his gaze shifting away. I don't know," he admitted. "But I'm going to find out." He took a deep breath, his gaze locking with hers. "I know you don't trust me, Francesca," he said. "And I understand why. But I need your help." "My help?" she asked, her voice incredulous. "Why would I help you?" "Because," he said, his voice low, "we're both pawns in this game, Francesca. Someone is trying to destroy both our families, and we're the only ones who can stop them." His words, so unexpected, so sincere, gave her pause. She looked into his eyes, and she saw a desperation, a vulnerability that she hadn't seen before. The sacred bonds of family were unraveling around them, and she was faced with a choice: cling to the remnants of a shattered past, or forge a new, dangerous alliance with the man who might be her only hope. The pensione room felt small, the weight of their shared predicament pressing down on them. Chapter 13. Beneath the gaze of watchful eyes. Lorenzo's words hung in the air, a fragile bridge across the chasm of mistrust and betrayal that separated them. Francesca stared at him, her mind reeling. Could she believe him? Could she trust him, even after everything that had happened? "Why should I believe you?" she asked, her voice still laced with suspicion. "Why should I trust you?" He stepped closer, his eyes pleading. "Because I'm telling you the truth, Francesca," he said. "Because I care about you. Because I would never hurt you, or your family." He reached out, his hand gently touching her arm. She didn't flinch away this time, her body frozen, uncertain. "I know I have a lot to prove," he continued, his voice low. "But I'm not my father. I'm not my grandfather. I don't want this war. I want peace." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "And I believe," he said, his voice a husky whisper, "that we can find it. Together." Francesca looked into his eyes, and she saw a flicker of something she hadn't seen before, a genuine sincerity, a desperate plea for understanding. She saw the weight of his family's legacy, the burden he carried, the desire for a different path. She thought about her brother, Marco, lying injured in a clinic, his life hanging in the balance. She thought about her father, his face filled with grief and accusation. She thought about the shattered remnants of her family, the unraveling of sacred bonds. She knew that she had a choice to make. She could cling to the past, to the hatred and the stress that had defined her life. Or she could take a leap of faith, a dangerous gamble, and trust the man who might be her enemy, but who also might be her only hope. "What do you propose?" she asked, her voice quiet, her gaze unwavering. Lorenzo took a deep breath, his expression hardening with determination. "We need to work together," he said. "We need to find out who attacked Marco, who is trying to destroy our families. We need to uncover the truth." He outlined his plan, a risky, dangerous strategy that involved infiltrating the ranks of their enemies, gathering information, uncovering secrets. It was a plan that could expose them to unimaginable danger, that could cost them their lives. "It's dangerous, Francesca," he said, his voice grave. "But it's the only way." Francesca nodded, her mind racing. She knew the risks, the potential consequences. But she also knew that she couldn't stand idly by while her family, while her world, was torn apart. "I'm in," she said, her voice firm, her gaze meeting his. "But on one condition." "What is it?" he asked. "We do this my way," she said. "No lies. No secrets. No manipulations. We tell each other everything." Lorenzo hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Agreed," he said. And so began their unlikely alliance, a dangerous partnership forged in the crucible of betrayal and mistrust. They left the pensione, venturing back into the treacherous world of the Roman underworld, a world of shadows, secrets, and watchful eyes. They started their investigation, gathering information, following leads, piecing together the puzzle of Marco's attack. They met in secret, in hidden cafes, in darkened alleyways, in forgotten corners of the city. They spoke in whispers, their every move cautious, their every word guarded. They discovered that the attack on Marco was not an isolated incident. There had been other attacks, other acts of violence, targeting both the Barone and De Luca families. Someone was deliberately escalating the conflict, stoking the flames of hatred and mistrust, pushing the two families towards all-out war. As they delved deeper, they uncovered a web of lies, betrayals, and hidden alliances. They discovered that the enemy was not who they expected, that the threat came from within their own ranks, from someone they trusted, someone they had considered family. They were being watched, constantly. Every move analyzed, every conversation scrutinized. They were playing a deadly game, and they knew one wrong step would mean certain exposure, and almost certainly death. The weight of this knowledge was heavy, but the shared burden, surprisingly, made it bearable. Chapter 14. Letters from a Hidden World. Their investigation led them to an old, abandoned palazzo in a forgotten corner of Rome. The building was a crumbling relic of a bygone era, its once grand facade now scarred with graffiti and decay. It was a place where secrets were whispered, where deals were made, where lives were bought and sold. Lorenzo had received an anonymous tip, a cryptic message suggesting that the key to understanding the attacks on their families lay hidden within the palazzo's walls. It was a risky lead, a potential trap, but they had no other choice. They entered the palazzo cautiously, their senses on high alert. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the creaking of floorboards and the scurrying of rats. They moved through the darkened rooms, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. They searched for hours, their efforts seemingly fruitless. The palazzo was a labyrinth of empty rooms, crumbling staircases, and hidden passages. It was a place where ghosts lingered, where the past refused to stay buried. Just as they were about to give up, Francesca noticed something unusual, a section of wall in one of the smaller rooms that seemed slightly out of place. She ran her fingers along the surface, feeling for a seam, a crack, anything that might indicate a hidden opening. She found it a small, almost invisible button concealed beneath a layer of peeling paint. She pressed the button, and a section of the wall slid open, revealing a narrow passage. Lorenzo exchanged a look with Francesca, his expression a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Let's go," he said, his voice low. They entered the passage, their flashlights illuminating the way. The passage led them to a small, hidden room, a secret chamber that had remained untouched for decades. The room was filled with antique furniture, dusty books, and stacks of old documents. It was a time capsule, a glimpse into a forgotten world. In the center of the room, on a large, ornate desk, lay a collection of letters, bound together with a faded ribbon. Francesca reached for the letters, her hand trembling. She untied the ribbon, carefully opening the first letter. The paper was yellowed and brittle, the ink faded, but the handwriting was still legible. The letters were written in Italian, a formal, elegant script that spoke of a different era. They were dated decades ago, written during a time of intense conflict between the Barone and De Luca families. As Francesca began to read, she realized that the letters were not what she expected. They were not missives of war, of strategy, of betrayal. They were love letters. The letters were written by a man named Alessandro Lorenzo's grandfather to a woman named Isabella, Francesca's grandmother. They were a testament to a forbidden love, a secret affair that had spanned years, a passion that had defied the boundaries of family, of loyalty, of hatred. Francesca and Lorenzo read the letters together, their voices hushed, their hearts pounding. They learned of a secret world, a world of stolen moments, of hidden rendezvous, of desperate longing. They learned of a love that had been doomed from the start, a love that had been sacrificed on the altar of family duty. As they read the final letter, A tear rolled down Francesca's cheek. The letter was filled with a sense of despair, of resignation, of a love that could never be. It was a farewell, a goodbye, a promise of eternal longing. Lorenzo reached out, his hand gently wiping away her tear. They were star-crossed lovers, he said, his voice soft. Just like us. Francesca looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. She saw the pain in his eyes, the reflection of his ancestors' tragic love. But we're different, Lorenzo, she said, her voice firm. We can choose a different path. We don't have to repeat their mistakes. He nodded, his gaze locking with hers. I know, he said. And I want to choose you. I want to choose us. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against hers. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the moment, to the forbidden desire that had been simmering between them, now fueled by the echoes of a love that had defied the ages. The letters, a testament to a hidden world, had revealed not only a secret past but also a possible future, a future they could forge together if they were brave enough to defy the odds. The weight of their families' histories pressed down on them, but for this moment, in this hidden room, they were free. Chapter 15. The Edge of Reckoning and Desire. The discovery of the letters had changed everything. It had revealed a hidden history, a secret connection between their families that transcended the generations of hatred and violence. It had also solidified Francesca's trust in Lorenzo, confirming his genuine desire for peace, for a different life. But the letters had also raised new questions. Who had known about the affair? Who had kept the letters hidden? And most importantly, who was now trying to reignite the feud between their families, using the past as a weapon? They left the abandoned palazzo, the letters secured safely, their minds racing with new possibilities, new suspicions. They knew that they were closer to the truth, but they also knew that they were walking on the edge of a precipice, that one wrong step could send them tumbling into the abyss. They returned to Lorenzo's secluded villa, the place where they had shared their first moments of genuine connection, the place where the storm had mirrored the turmoil within their hearts. It felt like a lifetime ago. They spread the letters out on a large table, studying them, analyzing them, searching for any clue, any hidden message, any indication of who might be behind the recent attacks. As they worked, they talked, sharing their thoughts, their fears, their suspicions. They were no longer just a Barone and a De Luca, not just pawns in a dangerous game, but partners, allies, bound together by a shared purpose, a shared desire for justice. As the night wore on, they grew closer, their bond strengthening with each shared discovery, each whispered confidence. The tension between them was palpable, a mixture of fear, excitement, and the undeniable pull of their forbidden attraction. Lorenzo reached out, his hand gently brushing against Francesca's cheek. We're close, Francesca, he said, his voice low. I can feel it. She nodded, her gaze meeting his. But we're also in danger, she said. We need to be careful. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against her ear. I know, he murmured. But I won't let anything happen to you. He kissed her, softly at first, then with increasing passion. She responded, her own lips parting beneath his, her arms wrapping around his neck. She lost herself in the kiss, in the feel of his body against hers, in the desperate need to forget, to escape, to find a moment of solace in the midst of the chaos. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more demanding. It was a kiss fueled by adrenaline, by fear, by the undeniable connection that had blossomed between them, a connection that had defied the odds, that had survived betrayal, mistrust, and the threat of violence. They broke apart, breathless, their hearts pounding. Lorenzo looked at her, his eyes dark with desire, his expression a mixture of tenderness and longing. Francesca, he said, his voice husky. He hesitated, his gaze shifting away. He seemed to be struggling with his words, with his emotions. What is it, Lorenzo? She asked, her voice soft. He took a deep breath, his gaze locking with hers. I'm falling in love with you, Francesca, he said, his voice raw, his eyes filled with a vulnerability that she had never seen before. The words, So unexpected, so sincere, took her breath away. She stared at him, her heart pounding, her mind reeling. "Lorenzo," she whispered, her voice trembling. She didn't know what to say. She was falling in love with him too, she realized, with a sudden, undeniable clarity. She had been fighting it, denying it, fearing it, but it was true. She loved him. She reached out, her hand gently cupping his face. "I'm falling in love with you too, Lorenzo," she said, her voice soft, her eyes filled with tears. He pulled her closer, his embrace tightening. He kissed her again, a long, slow kiss that sealed their confession, that bound them together in a way that nothing else could. But as they embraced, a sudden noise shattered the moment, the sound of breaking glass, coming from downstairs. They froze, their hearts pounding, their senses on high alert. They knew instantly that they were no longer alone, that the danger they had been anticipating had finally arrived. The edge of reckoning was upon them, and their desire, their newly confessed love, was about to be tested in the most brutal way possible. The reckoning and desire fueled their adrenaline. Chapter 16. Fire and Whispers in the Ruins. Lorenzo grabbed a heavy bronze candlestick from the table, his expression hardening with a protective fury Francesca had only glimpsed before. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "Lock the door." But Francesca shook her head, her own fear battling with a fierce determination. "No," she said, her voice low but firm. "We're in this together. I won't hide." She picked up a heavy bookend, its sharp edges offering a semblance of a weapon. It felt inadequate, but her resolve was unwavering. Lorenzo hesitated for a moment, then nodded, his eyes reflecting a mixture of respect and apprehension. "All right," he said, "but stay close." They crept down the stairs, their movements silent, their senses on high alert. The sound of voices harsh, guttural Italian echoed from the living room. They were not alone. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, they saw them, 3 men, dressed in black, their faces masked, ransacking the room. They were searching for something, their movements frantic, their intentions clearly malicious. One of the men turned, spotting them. He shouted something in Italian, alerting the others. Lorenzo didn't hesitate. He charged forward, swinging the candlestick with a force that sent the first man sprawling. Francesca followed close behind, swinging the bookend, striking another man on the arm. The fight was brutal, chaotic, a desperate struggle for survival. The men were larger, stronger, but Lorenzo and Francesca fought with a ferocity born of desperation and a fierce desire to protect each other. Lorenzo was a whirlwind of motion, his movements precise, his strikes powerful. He had clearly been trained in combat, his skills honed by a life lived on the edge. Francesca, despite her lack of training, fought with a courage she didn't know she possessed, fueled by adrenaline and a fierce determination to survive. One of the men lunged at Francesca, grabbing her arm, twisting it painfully. She cried out, but she didn't give up. She kicked him hard in the groin, forcing him to release her. Lorenzo saw her struggle, his eyes blazing with fury. He disarmed one of the men, knocking him unconscious with a swift blow to the head. He then turned his attention to the man who had attacked Francesca, striking him with a series of blows that sent him crashing to the floor. The remaining man, seeing his companions defeated, hesitated for a moment, then turned and fled, disappearing into the night. Lorenzo rushed to Francesca's side, his face etched with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice breathless. She nodded, her arm throbbing, her body bruised. I'm okay," she said, her voice trembling. They stood there, breathing heavily, their bodies trembling from the adrenaline rush. The living room was a shambles, furniture overturned, glass shattered, a testament to the violence that had just erupted. Suddenly, they smelled smoke. They looked around, their eyes widening in horror. The men had set fire to the villa. Flames were already licking at the curtains, spreading rapidly through the room. "We have to get out of here," Lorenzo shouted, grabbing Francesca's hand. They ran, fleeing the burning villa, the heat of the flames searing their skin. They escaped just as the roof collapsed, the villa engulfed in a raging inferno. They stood outside, watching as Lorenzo's sanctuary, the place where they had shared their most intimate moments, was consumed by flames. The fire illuminated the night sky, casting an eerie glow on their faces, reflecting the devastation, the loss, the uncertainty of their future. But as they stood there, amidst the ruins, their hands clasped tightly together, Francesca felt a surge of something unexpected hope. They had survived. They had fought together. They had protected each other. And they were still together. The fire, though destructive, had also forged a bond between them, a bond stronger than any adversity, any threat, any betrayal. The whispers in the ruins spoke not of defeat, but of resilience, of a love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger, more determined than ever. Chapter 17. The Heart's Silent War. The fire had destroyed Lorenzo's villa, but it had also ignited a new resolve within them. They were homeless, hunted, and facing an unknown enemy, but they were together, their bond forged in the crucible of violence and betrayal. They found refuge in a small, secluded apartment in a working-class neighborhood, far from the opulent villas and dangerous intrigues of their former lives. It was a place where they could blend in, disappear, become invisible. They spent their days and nights poring over the letters they had recovered from the abandoned palazzo, searching for any clue, any hidden message, any indication of who might be behind the attacks on their families. They also began to investigate the backgrounds of those closest to them, searching for any sign of disloyalty, any hint of a connection to the past, to the forbidden love affair between their grandparents. The investigation was slow, frustrating, and dangerous. They were constantly looking over their shoulders, aware that they were being watched, that their every move was being scrutinized. But amidst the danger and uncertainty, their love for each other continued to grow, deepening with each shared moment, each whispered confidence, each stolen kiss. They found solace in each other's arms, a refuge from the storm that raged around them. One evening, as they sat together in their small apartment, sharing a simple meal of bread and cheese, Francesca noticed something in one of the letters that she hadn't seen before. It was a small, almost imperceptible marking on the back of the envelope, a symbol that she recognized. "Lorenzo," she said, her voice excited, "look at this." She pointed to the marking, a tiny, stylized image of a serpent coiled around a dagger. Lorenzo's eyes widened in recognition. "That's the symbol of the Serpenti," he said, his voice low. The Serpenti were a shadowy organization, a secret society that had existed in Rome for centuries. They were rumored to be involved in all manner of illicit activities, from smuggling and extortion to political manipulation and murder. They were a legend, a whisper in the dark, a force to be feared. But why would they be involved? Francesca asked, her voice confused. "What do they have to do with our families?" Lorenzo shook his head, his expression grim. "I don't know," he said. "But I have a feeling we're about to find out." They delved deeper into the history of the Serpenti, searching for any connection to their families, to the forbidden love affair between their grandparents. They discovered that the Serpenti had a long and bloody history, a history intertwined with the rise and fall of powerful families in Rome. They also discovered that the Serpenti had a code, a set of rules that govern their actions. One of those rules was that they never forgot a debt, that they always sought revenge for any perceived wrong. And then they founded a record of a transaction, a payment made decades ago by Lorenzo's grandfather to the Serpenti. The payment was for a service, the elimination of a rival, a man who had threatened the De Luca family's power. The rival's name?
Alessandro Barone.
Francesca's grandfather. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The Serpenti were not just involved, they were at the heart of the conflict. Lorenzo's grandfather had used them to eliminate Francesca's grandfather, and now, decades later, the Serpenti were seeking their revenge, targeting both families, reigniting the feud, fulfilling their ancient code. But there was one more twist, one more secret hidden within the records. The payment made by Lorenzo's grandfather had not been in money, but in something far more valuable, a promise. a promise of future service, a debt to be repaid at a later date. And that date, it seemed, had arrived. The Serpenti were not just seeking revenge, they were collecting on a debt owed by Lorenzo. The heart-silent war had been raging for decades, passed down through generations, and now it had come full circle. The past was not dead, it was alive, and it was demanding its due. They knew what they had to do. Chapter 18. Where Shadows Meet the Dawn. The revelation that the Serpenti were behind the attacks, and that Lorenzo was unknowingly indebted to them, changed everything. They were no longer just fighting for their families. For their survival, they were fighting against a shadowy organization that had manipulated them, used them, and threatened to destroy everything they held dear. They knew that they couldn't confront the Serpenti directly. The organization was too powerful, too entrenched in the fabric of Roman society. They needed a plan, a strategy that would allow them to expose the Serpenti, to break their hold on their families, to finally end the cycle of violence and betrayal. They decided to use the letters, the evidence of the forbidden love affair between their grandparents, as leverage. They knew that the Serpenti valued secrecy, that they would go to any lengths to protect their reputation, their power. They contacted a journalist, a woman known for her integrity and her courage, someone who had a reputation for exposing corruption and challenging the powerful. They shared the letters with her, revealing the truth about the Serpenti's involvement in the feud between their families, the debt owed by Lorenzo's grandfather. The journalist was shocked, intrigued, and determined to help. She agreed to publish the story, to expose the Serpenti to the world, to bring their crimes to light. But they knew that publishing the story would be dangerous, that it would put them in the Serpenti's crosshairs. They needed to be prepared, to be protected. Lorenzo reached out to his contacts in the underworld, to those who had remained loyal to him, to those who also sought a way out of the cycle of violence. He gathered a small, trusted group of allies, men and women who were willing to fight alongside him, to protect him and Francesca. Francesca, in turn, reached out to her father. She knew that he had disowned her, that he believed she had betrayed him. But she also knew that he loved her brother, Marco, and that he would do anything to protect him. She arranged a secret meeting with her father, in a neutral location, a small church far from the prying eyes of the Serpenti and the Barone family. She told him everything, revealing the truth about the Serpenti, the debt owed by Lorenzo's grandfather, the attacks on their families. Don Alessandro listened in silence, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He was shocked, angered, and relieved. He had been wrong about Francesca, wrong about Lorenzo. He had misjudged them, betrayed them. "I don't know what to say," he said, his voice hoarse. "I was wrong about you, Francesca. About both of you." Francesca reached out, her hand gently touching his arm.
"It's not too late, Father," she said.
"We can still fix this. We can still stop the Serpenti." Don Alessandro nodded, his eyes filled with a renewed determination. "I will help you," he said. "I will do whatever it takes." He agreed to provide protection for Francesca and Lorenzo, to use his resources to help them expose the Serpenti. He also agreed to meet with Lorenzo, to finally put an end to the feud that had divided their families for generations. The meeting between Don Alessandro and Lorenzo was tense, fraught with years of mistrust and animosity. But as they talked, as they shared their stories, as they realized that they had both been manipulated by the Serpenti, a fragile truce began to form. They agreed to work together, to combine their forces, to confront the Serpenti and end their reign of terror. They knew that it would be a dangerous battle, that they might not all survive. But they were united, determined, and ready to fight for their families, for their future, for their love. Where shadows met the dawn, a new alliance was forged, an alliance born of shared pain, shared purpose, and a shared desire for peace. The final confrontation was looming. Chapter 19. The Cost of Redemption's Embrace. The plan was set. The journalist was ready to publish the story, exposing the Serpenti and their manipulation of the Barone and De Luca families. Lorenzo and Don Alessandro had gathered their forces, preparing for the inevitable backlash. Francesca and Lorenzo were at the heart of it all, their love for each other a beacon of hope amidst the looming darkness. They knew that the Serpenti would strike back, that they would not go down without a fight. They were prepared for violence, for betrayal, for sacrifice. The story broke, sending shockwaves through the Roman underworld and beyond. The Serpenni's carefully constructed facade of secrecy and power began to crumble. Their allies deserted them, their enemies turned against them. Their control over the city began to slip. But the Serpenni were not defeated yet. They launched a counterattack, targeting those who had betrayed them, those who had dared to expose their crimes. Lorenzo and Francesca found themselves hunted, constantly on the move, hiding in the shadows, relying on their allies for protection. They were living on the edge, their lives hanging in the balance. One evening, as they were moving to a new safe house, they were ambushed. A group of Serpenni assassins, armed and ruthless, attacked them in a narrow alleyway. Lorenzo and Francesca fought back, using their combined skills, their fierce determination, their love for each other as their weapons. But they were outnumbered, outgunned. Lorenzo was wounded, a bullet grazing his shoulder. Francesca fought desperately to protect him, shielding him with her own body. Just as they were about to be overwhelmed, Don Alessandro and his men arrived, turning the tide of the battle. The Serpenni assassins were defeated, killed or captured. But the victory came at a cost. Don Alessandro had been shot, a bullet piercing his chest. He lay on the ground, bleeding, his life slipping away. Francesca rushed to his side, her heart breaking. "Father," she cried, tears streaming down her face. Don Alessandro looked up at her, his eyes filled with pain, but also with peace. "Francesca," he whispered, his voice weak. "I'm proud of you. You did the right thing." He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. "I love you, Francesca," he said. "And I forgive you." "And Lorenzo." His hand slipped from her cheek, his eyes closing. He was gone. Francesca wept, her grief overwhelming. She had lost her father, but she had also gained his forgiveness, his blessing. She had redeemed herself in his eyes, and in her own. Lorenzo held her, his own heart filled with grief and gratitude. He had lost his enemy, but he had gained a father-in-law, a family. He had found redemption, a chance to break free from the cycle of violence and hatred that had defined his life. The death of Don Alessandro, though tragic, had a profound impact. It galvanized the forces against the Serpenni, uniting the Barone and De Luca families in a way that nothing else could have. The remaining members of the Serpenni were hunted down, brought to justice, their organization shattered, their power broken. The reign of terror was over. The cost of redemption had been high, but the embrace of a new future, a future free from the shadows of the past, was finally within reach. The final confrontation was near, but the most significant battle, the battle for forgiveness and unity, had already been won. The city, once steeped in darkness, began to breathe again. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. With the Serpenni's power broken and their organization in ruins, only one task remained: to confront the mastermind, the one who had orchestrated the attacks, the one who had manipulated both families for their own gain. The evidence pointed to one person, Don Carlo De Luca, Lorenzo's father. It was a devastating revelation, a betrayal that cut deeper than any wound. Lorenzo had believed in his father, had respected him, had even, in his own way, loved him. But now he knew the truth. His father was a monster, a man who had used his own son, his own family, to further his own twisted ambitions. Lorenzo, accompanied by Francesca and a small group of trusted allies from both the Barone and De Luca families, went to confront Don Carlo at the De Luca villa, the place where it had all begun. They found Don Carlo in his study, surrounded by his remaining loyalists. He was defiant, unrepentant, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating hatred. "Lorenzo," he said, his voice dripping with scorn. "You betrayed me. You betrayed your family. You sided with them." He gestured towards Francesca and the Barone allies, his face contorted with disgust. Lorenzo stepped forward, his expression unwavering. "You betrayed us, father," he said, his voice firm. "You used us. You manipulated us. You killed Don Alessandro. Don Carlo laughed, a harsh, chilling sound.
He was a weakling, he said. He deserved to die.
Just like all the Baroness. It's over, Father, Lorenzo said. The Serpenti are finished. Your power is gone. It's time to surrender. Don Carlo's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting to Francesca. It's her fault, he said, his voice filled with venom. She seduced you. She turned you against me. Francesca stepped forward, her own eyes blazing with anger.
I did nothing of the sort, she said.
You are the one who is responsible. You are the one who has caused all this pain, all this suffering. Don Carlo lunged at Francesca, his hand reaching for a hidden weapon. But Lorenzo was faster. He intercepted his father, grabbing his arm, wrestling him to the ground. The two men struggled, their bodies locked in a desperate embrace. It was a battle not just of strength, but of wills, of generations of hatred and violence finally coming to a head. Lorenzo overpowered his father, disarming him, pinning him to the floor. He looked down at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and disgust. It's over, Father, he repeated, his voice trembling. It's finally over. He didn't kill him. He couldn't. Despite everything, Don Carlo was still his father. Instead, he handed him over to the authorities to face justice for his crimes. The final confrontation was over. The hearts and loyalties of two families, torn apart by decades of hatred and betrayal, had finally found a path to reconciliation, to peace. As Lorenzo and Francesca stood together, watching as Don Carlo was taken away, they knew that the scars of the past would never fully heal. But they also knew that they had a future together, a future built on love, trust, and a shared commitment to a different kind of life. The dawn was breaking, casting a golden light over the city of Rome, a city that had finally emerged from the shadows, a city that had found redemption, a city that was ready to embrace a new era of peace. The long war was over, and in its place, a fragile, hopeful peace had begun. Epilogue. 5 years later, Francesca and Lorenzo stood on the terrace of a newly rebuilt villa overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. It was a beautiful, modern structure, a stark contrast to the dark, oppressive villas of their past. It was a symbol of their new life, a life built on love, trust, and a shared commitment to peace. The villa was filled with the sounds of laughter, of children playing, of families gathering. The Baroness and the De Lucas, once sworn enemies, were now united, bound together by the marriage of Francesca and Lorenzo, by the shared trauma of the past, by the hope for a brighter future. Marco, recovered from his injuries, stood nearby, his arm around his wife, a gentle smile on his face. He had taken over as the head of the Barone family, leading them with a wisdom and compassion that his father had lacked. He had embraced the peace, working alongside Lorenzo to ensure that the cycle of violence would never be repeated. Lorenzo held a small child in his arms, a beautiful little girl with dark hair and bright, inquisitive eyes. She was their daughter, Isabella, named after Francesca's grandmother, the woman who had loved Lorenzo's grandfather, the woman who had shown them that love could transcend even the deepest of divisions. Francesca watched them, her heart filled with a profound sense of peace, of contentment. She had found her sanctuary, not in a place, but in a person, in a family, in a love that had defied the odds, that had survived betrayal, violence, and the weight of generations of hatred. She looked out at the same sea that her grandmother and Lorenzo's grandfather had gazed upon, the same sea that had witnessed their forbidden love, their tragic separation. But now, the sea reflected a different story, a story of hope, of reconciliation, of a love that had finally found its way home. Lorenzo walked towards her, his daughter giggling in his arms. He handed Isabella to Francesca, then wrapped his arms around both of them, his embrace warm and protective. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice soft, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Francesca nodded, her heart overflowing with love. "It is," she replied. "Paradise."
And it was.
A paradise forged in the fires of adversity, a paradise built on the foundations of forgiveness, a paradise that would last, not just for them, but for generations to come. The echoes of the past still lingered, but they were faint, distant, overshadowed by the vibrant symphony of the present, a present filled with love, laughter, and the promise of a future free from the shadows of the past. The scent of roses, no longer tinged with betrayal, filled the air, a sweet, fragrant reminder of the enduring power of love.
The end.